Let me let them in. So sorry for the slightly late start. Thanks for your opinions about teen voting and little kids. All right, so I am in the process of grading question 3, which I think maybe I'll finish tonight. We'll see. And then question 4, I think is going to be a weekend activity for me because I have something tomorrow that's probably going to take me all day. So I don't think I'm going to get to any of your grading tomorrow. So I think your grading will be either Saturday or a Sunday thing. And then we don't have class on Tuesday, apparently, because of the election, because I think your school is an election site, so they're closing it. I could be right or wrong about that, but I feel like I'm right about that. But on the weekly questions, just my general tips for a few more points. 1, make sure you answer all parts of the question. One thing that's been pretty common on the one I'm currently grading, which is causes of the Great Depression and what did the government do before 1932 and earlier to try to make things better. A lot of people are skipping that last part. I was trying to ask you what Herbert Hoover did. And a lot of people are just skipping that, and they're going through causes of the Great Depression, but they're not talking about Herbert Hoover. Sometimes you're saying really big general stuff without specific examples, and there are some of you that are giving specific examples, but not big general stuff. So you're doing the bullet point, like here are all the facts, but you're not telling me why the facts matter. So get all the points, answer every part of the question. Make sure you answer it carefully, like answer what I'm actually asking, because again, on that New Deal, or not, it's not the New Deal question, but the Great Depression question, a bunch of people are starting to talk about FDR on that, and he's 33 and later. So make sure you're actually answering what I asked. You want specific details, so we have to have examples, but you also need like the big conclusion analysis thing that ties it back to the question. So just, do the whole thing. I'm also, because
Ms. Turner, you just muted yourself on
I
accident, I
saw
think.
that. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. How did I do that? I don't know. But thanks for telling me. Wonder what I was going to say. Think about it for a second. Oh, I remember now. Because I used to teach English, and because, it's important to write well, I may occasionally like highlight things that are grammar usage errors, mechanics errors. I'm not counting off for them, but I may say like, hey, you should probably read your stuff before you turn it in. And the cool thing about being your age, or even my age, but writing right now, is that your technology gives you a heads up when you make an error. Like if you misspell something, I know sometimes it tells me like, you should probably put a comma here, and it's like, you should mind your own business, computer. But sometimes their suggestions are really quite helpful, especially on the spelling. Now, if you're like me and you type really poorly, sometimes you just type so poorly that even spell check can't help you. But as a rule, sorry, I'm having heating pad issues here, but as a rule, that technology can be of some assistance to you as well. So use it because it's there. I think that's all I have to say. If you have questions about why you're not getting enough points, always feel free to ask. I will try to put comments in, and hopefully you can read those comments. I assume that you have access to them. And I know where I put them. I don't know where they show up on your end. It's not great with technology, as you already know. So let's talk about the notes. Yeah. And if you guys have questions about the reading, also, there are some people, I don't think it's so much of an issue in this class as it is the other two, where there's just no evidence at all that you've paid any attention to anything I've ever said. You haven't looked at my lecture notes, and you haven't looked at the book. So I get like weird answers like, when I was back in high school, they said this, or one time I heard, or like you saw, something on Twitter. It just seems like there's some rumors you plucked off the cyberspace or something. So that's really more not your class. But if you're ever in the mood to do that, don't. All right. I feel like we talked about the Korean conflict last time, but I'll just kind of remind you of general stuff. Thing number one, this is a UN directed conflict. So South Korea goes to the UN and says, help. And the UN says, okay. And NATO assembles some troops and they go through the UN and they're headed up by MacArthur, who gets in a little bit of trouble because he says, hey, maybe we should nuke North Korea. And Truman, in a very polite way, says, hey, maybe you should shut up about nuking North Korea. And he doesn't. So then Truman says, you're fired. And then MacArthur gets fired. And then he gives some speech about how old soldiers never die, they slowly fade away, which is what the little quote is a reference to. But then I thought about that and I thought none of you would, there's no reason any of my students would get that reference because you'd actually have to have heard that speech. And I don't have any idea why you would have heard a Douglas MacArthur speech when you're a teenager in high school or an adult out of high school that doesn't teach history. Eisenhower, of course, gets elected in the middle of the conflict. Well, 1950, it's not the middle of the conflict, but after the conflict breaks out, because he makes, 52. It is the middle of the conflict because Truman got elected in 48. So Eisenhower promises in 52 that if you elect him, he will go to Korea and end the war himself. So he does, and he does, sort of. He does go there. It does end, maybe because of him, maybe because Stalin died. And as I might have mentioned last time, Stalin's really the driving force behind the Soviet desire to fund this conflict. Once Stalin dies, people are more willing to speak out and say, hey, I think this is a bad use of our money. People didn't like to contradict Stalin because he's worse than a high school principal. He will have you killed if you disagree with him. You guys don't have any principals that will have you killed if you disagree with them. Those are all band directors. You know what I'm saying. So, okay. So Stalin dies, Soviets go, we're out. And some of you are going, well, what about China? China helped. I know China helped. Yeah, they did. They sent people. They had a lot of people, not too much money. So they wouldn't have had the money for the material that you needed, the war stuff. So when the war ends, there's a ceasefire, negotiations, but no official peace treaty. So they're still waiting to reunify in Korea, even to this day, which I would not expect anytime soon, but you never know. And what's the latest? I haven't even heard anything about Korea in a long time. North Korea, is their dude still alive? Kim Jong, is it Un or
Kim
Il?
Jong-un, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Because
I
Kim
heard about
Jong,
he was dead, but I
yeah,
don't know.
Kim Jong Il was the guy in charge during this war. No, Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un. Yeah. So this guy is the grandson. The current guy is the grandson of this guy. And yeah, last I'd heard he was dead, but then he magically showed back up or something. So I don't know. Maybe I'll check on that during our class time on Tuesday when I'm not teaching you. We'll see. Catch up on my North Korea news. I also remember we had some basketball player go there to try to bring peace. That crazy one that drinks too much. But I can't remember his name.
Scottie Pippen.
No, I don't know if Scottie Pippen drinks too much. Do you think he does? Somebody's in the waiting room. Oh, that's sad. I'm sorry. Why didn't it come up? Crud. Let me stop the sharing and see if the waiting. Oh, there it is. I'm so sorry to whoever was in the waiting room. Nobody played with Scottie Pippen, I think. I know we're not supposed to be talking about this right now. Crud, what was that crazy guy's name? He's a really good defender, and he played on that Bulls team that was so good. God, he was just nutty. All right, back to sharing stuff. Rodman, Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman. It's the important stuff, right? All right, so I feel like we're done talking about Korea, plus I somehow got Dennis Rodman in there. And we got Scottie Pippen in there too, who I think is a relatively sane member of that team who maybe didn't drink too much or have a gambling issue, which, seemed to be a problem for some of the other folks. All right, Cold War. Cold War. So when we talk about the Cold War, we're talking about not conflict, not direct military conflict, but we're arguing with each other. So, like there's a Cold War on the sideline of that U10 soccer game that I talked about before the game, but apparently there's an actual war between a couple of the players because I guess they hit each other. So, Cold War is when you're just talking and you're not really doing stuff to each other, but you might be threatening each other. And, war is just, it's war. So, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union is referred to as a Cold War because we never had direct conflict. I know what you're saying. You're saying you just talked about the Korean conflict, and that clearly had direct conflict, and people died, and people got shot, and things got blown up, and you are correct. But it wasn't US versus USSR. It was technically North Korea versus South Korea. But I know the US and the USSR were really kind of the driving forces behind that. And what goes on in Vietnam and what will go on in Cuba and some other stuff. So the difference between the Cold War and that, actual combat is it's really about whose land you blow up. So the United States and the Soviet Union did a fine job blowing up other people's land. Okay, now if you're wondering why we're fighting with the Soviet Union, you already know. They're evil, godless communists, and they want to control the world. Yes. So it's going to be freedom versus totalitarianism. It's going to be democracy versus communism. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Oh, that kind of hurt. And I recognize also that democracy is a form of government and communism, technically an economic system, but that's not how we saw it. We saw communism as a government with a totalitarian leader. So I guess I should have said maybe more correctly capitalism versus communism, but that's certainly not how we thought about it. Now, our CIA and Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Department were very involved in this conflict, as you might imagine. And the book will talk about how much money we spent promoting art and music and things like that. That was very pro-West, pro-US. So we wanted to make sure that art and music spread throughout the world because we wanted everyone to see Western culture as something positive and free and open and really representative of all the goodness that is the United States. So there you go. It's why all the music was so good in the 50s. Like, I don't know what music was going on in the 50s. Good golly, Miss Molly, and whatever Chuck Berry stuff was going on. And of course, Elvis. Your book talks about Elvis. Have you read the chapter yet? Have you guys read the chapter yet? And I think your book suggests that Elvis is popular because he sounds black, but he's white. It's not exactly how they say it, but that's essentially what they're saying. It's like, I don't know. Maybe. In the modern era, we might see that as cultural appropriation. I don't know if you would see it as cultural appropriation. I would also suggest to you that Elvis Presley lived in the Mississippi Delta and his family was generationally sharecroppers. So that's the culture of that region, recognizing that Elvis was white and that culture is more black, if we can say that. Can we say that? Yeah. All right. But I don't know. I think all that stuff's really, it's kind of complicated, maybe. But anyway. So we're exporting our culture because we want other countries to like our culture, because then they'll like us and they'll want to be more like us instead of the evil, godless communists of the Soviet Union, who probably didn't have very good music or culture. I think they were more about classical music, more of the orchestra kind of stuff, and opera and ballet. Yeah, ballet is pretty good. Where we really have those more direct competitions, cultural competitions with the evil godless communists was in the Olympics. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, all right. But our consistent theme in CIA and defense-sponsored posters, artwork, plays, that kind of stuff is freedom. So freedom of speech, freedom of expression versus the limits of totalitarianism. Now, if the evil godless communists were trying to make us look bad culturally, they would remind everybody that maybe we were a little segregated and they were not. They did not practice racial segregation. Exactly. I mean, they practiced some other stuff like if we disagree with you, we'll put you in jail. And there were certain ethnic groups that they repressed, but it wasn't racial. They did not harass people of African descent. Now, some of you are going like, how many people of African descent did you notice in the Soviet Union? I'm going to go with not many. Now, in eastern part of the Soviet Union, there may have been some issues with people of Asian descent. All right, back to business. At the UN, they just started that thing and they're trying to keep everybody peaceful and happy and not fighting and that kind of thing. So they write the Declaration of Human Rights, and each major country gets a representative on that committee to write that declaration. Our representative is the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and they emphasize the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And there's really no planned enforcement of this, so there's no real consequence necessarily of violating this, more that you might get sanctioned or people will talk badly about you at the UN, that sort of thing. If you're wondering why there's no planned enforcement, a variety of reasons. One of the parts of the UN Declaration of Human Rights says that you will not be discriminated against on the basis of race or ethnicity. The United States may have still had some issues with that in the 1950s. And as some of you are going like, we might still have some issues with that now. Maybe. I guarantee you they were much more obvious and overt in the 1950s and much more truly systemic. I mean, by systemic, I don't mean that there isn't possibly systemic racism at this point. What I'm trying to say, probably not saying well, is that it's very much intentional and directed during that time period. I really doubt that there's any place in the United States where when they have the pre-shift meeting for the police commissioner says like, I really want you to go out there and harass some minorities today. I'm guessing that doesn't happen. I am guessing in the 50s that did happen. They didn't say it quite that way. It was probably, much more racist. But you know what I'm trying to say. Maybe you don't. All right, but our problem with enforcing this is that it might be enforced against us. There are other countries that also had problems that were, equally as large. So most countries looked at what they did wrong and said, hey, we really don't want you coming in and telling us we're doing this wrong. We'll fix it when we get to it. Or it's not really a problem, so we don't need to fix it. And also countries would have to commit part of their military to go do the enforcement, and nobody really wants to do that. So, all right, in the meantime, back in the United States, Harry Truman, after World War II, says, you know what, we had a bunch of troops fighting overseas to end racism. We talked about this double V campaign. Maybe it's time to think about ending racism here in the United States. So he gets together a commission to study racism. And they come out with a report that they call To Secure These Rights, which is a reference to part of the Constitution. One of the major recommendation of this commission is that it is time to desegregate every public part of life. So everything needs to be desegregated. And as you can imagine, around 1950, that advice doesn't go over that well. So that is not a widely accepted conclusion by most people in the United States. Lots of folks in the US went, no, that's just not going to happen. So even though the Presidential Commission recommended this, and then the president follows up on this idea by desegregating the military with an executive order, which is very upsetting to the leaders of the military. But then they, because they are led by their commander-in-chief, who is the president, they do what they're supposed to do, whether they agree with it or not. The Congress is not interested in extending that desegregation. Part of what I think Truman was hoping is that if people saw that this could be done peacefully in the military, a very large traditional organization, if they could change, then the rest of the country could change relatively peacefully as well. If you've read the textbook, which I assume you all have, you've noticed as well that Dr. Foner suggests to you that Truman's read some polls, Polls, and believes that this point of view might help him win his election. So he thinks that being in favor of desegregation might help him on voting day. So, no. But he does get reelected. I think that's in part because of this, but it's in larger part because of the Berlin airlift. I feel confident of saying that. All right, other stuff, but I don't have statistics. I didn't take polls back in 48 because one, I wasn't alive. That's enough reasons, right? Okay. So Truman desegregates the military. His commission recommends desegregating everything. He also proposes something called the Fair Deal. And the Fair Deal is an extension of New Deal programs to people who are poor. And the goal of this program would be to end poverty, because we really were in an era of prosperity post-World War II that will last into the 1960s. So if we ever had a chance to end poverty, this is the time to do it. It really is, because we have the smallest percentage of people in poverty and the most people benefiting from the good economy. So the thought was, if we extended job creation, public works projects, added universal health care to the people who couldn't afford health care, and then beefed up the public schools, then poverty would end. So it seemed like a good idea. Congress said no, if you're wondering. You knew that, didn't you? So Congress is not excited about desegregating stuff, and they are not interested in the Fair Deal. Oops. Southern Democrats were so frustrated by To Secure These Rights recommendations that they had a little split in their party, and they nominated a fellow named Strom Thurmond, who ran in 1948 as a Dixiecrat. Yes, a Dixiecrat, which sounds like what it is, a Southern Democrat. And the main point of their proposal or platform was segregation. Their slogan was segregation now, segregation forever, in case you needed that clarified. And he wins 5 states. He wins South Carolina, that's where he's from. And we've already mentioned a couple times he's a Democrat, right? Okay. South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. So just wanted to make sure that you understood it wasn't Texas. If you were nervous, it was not Texas. All right, so Dixiecrats led by Strom Thurmond splinter away from the regular Democrats because of the to secure these rights thing, and because Truman, who, you know, when you have the president running, he is the head of your party essentially, and he wants to add civil rights to as a permanent part of the party platform. So this is really frustrating to Southern Democrats who see segregation as a violation of centuries of tradition that has worked really well for white people in the South. All right. Now, Strom Thurmond later on will become a Republican. I think that happens late 60s, early 70s. And he had also been a Klan member, that would be the KKK, and he had been the Grand Legal, which I don't know exactly what that is because I just don't know, but it's one of the major leaders of the national KKK. Now, if you're wondering, do you spend time thinking about the KKK? My guess is you don't think about it much. But the KKK was a national organization in this era, so they were essentially a corporation. So they had corporate headquarters and stuff. Can you imagine? Home of the KKK. Can you imagine? I am guessing that was in the South. That's weird that I don't know that. But I would almost guess it was in, oh, I don't even know. I don't even want to guess. But I may look that up while I'm looking up whatever else I said I would look up, which I've already forgotten. All right. Oh, the other thing about Strom Thurmond, are you ready for more about Strom Thurmond? You know how Strom Thurmond was saying segregation now, segregation forever while he's running for president in 1948? Guess what else he's doing? Having an affair with a Black woman. How do we know this? Are we sneaking around? Is there a press, you know, looking for this kind of stuff? No. During this era, the press doesn't look for that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, the press covers that kind of stuff up during this time period. So the press has all kinds of dirt on the president. They just don't share it. It's like an understood that you keep those secrets. How we know about this is they have a child. So there's literally evidence who outlives Strom Thurmond. And so when Strom Thurmond dies a long time later, I think it was like 2001, he's 100 years old and he's still a senator. Can you imagine? Goodness. When he dies, the next day, there's this weird little press conference at this house somewhere in Los Angeles area. And there's this older African-American woman, because remember, Strom's 100 when he dies. So his child is 70 or 65 or so, because he had to be at least 35 to run for president. So this lady comes out and she says, I just want to say two things. One, yes, Strom Thurmond was my father. And no, I don't want to talk about it. And then she just went back in, and that was pretty much it. So there you go. So Strom Thurmond, Mr. Segregation, is having an affair with a Black woman and a child with her. Yeah, craziness. All right. Oh, I mentioned already, Truman desegregates the military by executive order. Do you guys know what executive order is? Do we ever talk about this stuff? You haven't had the government class yet. So executive order, have you heard of this? Are you going to answer? Are you guys recovering from the PSAT? I'm going to type it in the messages. Are these messages? Okay. Oops. If I type it there, it only goes to one person. Let me try again. What is an executive order? Let's see how I do on the typing. Pretty good, but where's the question mark? Dang it. Okay, there we go. All right. So you guys are supposed to answer this now. I got all day. Actually, I have like 20 minutes. Oh my gosh. There's always comedy. Somebody typed in an order that is executive. I did ask for this, right? All right. Somebody else said they were going to say the same thing. Great minds think alike, don't they? All right. Let me ask this. Who gives an executive order? Like what person? Would it be somebody in the Congress? Would it be a judge? Be a random person on the street? Smart aleck teen at Cedar Park High School? President. There we go. Okay, so the president gives one, and it has the same effect as law. So it's the president making a law. So there you go. Does Congress have to approve it? You only have two options here, yes or no. So do you think Congress has to approve? That is, yeah, somebody said no, and that is correct. That's one of the huge bonuses of being president, is you can give executive orders. Do you figure you can give a lot of them? I mean, there's not a rule about it. But if you just went around making executive orders all the time, do you think the other branches of the government would be okay with that? No. Which branch is supposed to make the laws? Do you think it's the executive, which the president's part of, the judicial, which is, the Supreme Court and other courts, or the legislative, the Congress part? Who makes the laws? You guys really don't want to play along with me today, do you? All right.
Yeah, I think we're all tired out from that PSAT, like you said
Yes,
before.
man. The PSAT must have gotten to you guys. Clearly, there's no part on the PSAT about branches of government, or you would have studied that. So yeah, the legislative makes the laws. Judicial is supposed to decide if their laws are constitutional, and the executive is supposed to carry out the laws. But that whole idea of checks and balances allows each branch to do a little bit of something that might be part of the other branch on occasion. Like the executive can make an executive order. And I think, you don't have to agree with me at all, but I think that things like what Truman did here, desegregating the military, that's a really good purpose for the executive order, because it's something that needs to be done, but he knows there's not popular will to do it. Now, he also doesn't want to desegregate everything, because he thinks if he desegregates everything, there'll be kind of a civil war, and he's probably right about that. But he wants to get stuff started. Now, if the judicial branch thought that that executive order was not constitutional, if somebody appealed to the Supreme Court could overturn that. Now, there's nothing Congress could do about it, but there is something the judiciary could do about it. When Congress passes a law, if the president doesn't like it, he can veto it, but they can override his veto. But then the Supreme Court can say, like, that law is bogus, and kick it out. So there's usually a fallback from one of the branches if they think one of the other branches has gone rogue. Does any of that make sense? But this executive order, the Supreme Court isn't going to say is unconstitutional, because it's not. And the Congress isn't going to add to it, because they're chicken. Because, well, they don't want a civil war. And later on, not much later on, 1954, when the Supreme Court decides it's probably time to desegregate public schools, they talk a lot about what the public reaction to their verdict is going to be. I mean, they're not ignoring that there's going to be a pretty strong reaction. They get that. So, all right. No more questions. I won't ask you anything else. All right, more stuff. The bullet points, stuff that's going on during this time period. We really hate communists, and most of these bullet points are evidence of how much we hate communists. Bullet point number 1, there's something called the House Un-American Activities Committee that is headed by a fellow named Richard Nixon, and it forces people to name names. So they call people in front of their committee and they say, like, are you now or have you ever been affiliated with the Communist Party? And then they say no. And then they say, well, did you ever know anybody who was? And then you say yes. And they go, like, we want to know who it is. And then you either say, okay, it was Fred, Or you say like, I'm not saying because it's Fifth Amendment, I shouldn't have to tell you, that sort of thing. If you refuse to answer their questions, then you might lose your job. You could be charged with, something as well. You might get in trouble, but mostly you're probably going to get blacklisted where people wouldn't hire you. This happened to a group of people called the Hollywood 10. These are screenwriters and producers, and I think there might have been one actor. And they were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they just said, no, we're not telling you, none of your business. We have freedom of speech. It's intended to be for political speech, so we're not telling you. You can't make us. So they get blacklisted, and they never get jobs again, except one guy who wrote under a pseudonym. There's another guy who gets called before HUAC, and he's the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which is the union for entertainment type people. And that guy's name is Ronald Reagan. Have you heard of him? I told you I wasn't going to ask you any more questions, but you've heard of Ronald Reagan, yes? If you lived in Williamson County, you would have, because we name like every third thing after Ronald Reagan out here, because we love him. He's like the ideal Republican, but he's a Democrat back then, by the way. When he gets called before the committee, he names names. So he is more concerned about communism than he is not naming names. The Karen and Smith Act require government employees to take loyalty oaths. So you get sworn in when you get a government job, and you have to pledge allegiance to your country and the Constitution, to defend and protect the Constitution. We're going to add God to the Pledge of Allegiance. Before this era, we just pledged allegiance to the flag, and but not to God. We add God in there. Yeah. It's funny, I was sitting here trying to think what the Pledge of Allegiance is. Pledge allegiance to the flag, and I can't remember, but I'm really tired and don't feel good today. Do you ever have trouble remembering the Pledge of Allegiance? That makes me feel un-American.
All the time.
Okay. All right. You guys say it. Well, hey, I'm going to ask you another question, even though I said I wasn't. Pandemic school, do you say the Pledge of Allegiance ever? And pledge to the Texas flag?
No.
Okay. What if Dan Patrick finds out? You guys are all in trouble. There's a law that says we have to say it every day at public school in Texas.
Oh, wow.
All right.
I guess we're all criminals.
You are. I think no one will arrest you, though. As long as you take all those tests, you'll be fine. STAR and PSAT, you're covered. No one will arrest. So we add God to the Pledge of Allegiance. Alger Hiss is a State Department employee who's accused of being a communist by a guy who used to be a spy, and he was a double agent, so he pretended to be a communist spy, but he was really spying on communist spies for the spies of the United States. And that guy's name was Whitaker Chambers. So he said, hey, Alger Hiss is a dang communist spy. And then Alger Hiss said, I am not a dang communist spy. I'm just a dude who works for the State Department. And then Whitaker Chambers says, you're the liar. And then Alger Hiss says, no, you're the liar. And then Whitaker Chambers says, or Alger Hiss says, I don't even know that guy. He's crazy. And then Whitaker Chambers says, come with me to the pumpkin patch. You think I'm making this up, but I am not. So he takes some reporters and an FBI guy to the pumpkin patch, where he had apparently hollowed out a pumpkin ahead of time. It's some pumpkin patch in Maryland. So they go there, he lifts the lid off the pumpkin and pulls out some microfilm, and then they go and look at it later, and there's a fairly famous picture of Richard Nixon unscrolling the film and looking at it. And there's a picture of Alger Hiss with Whitaker Chambers, and Alger Hiss said he didn't even know him. So it's like, ha ha, I have a picture of the two of us together that I found in the pumpkin that I hollowed out in Maryland. What a weird story, and it's completely true. So then Alger Hiss gets convicted of perjury, but not spying. But it's really bad for his career, as you might imagine. These Rosenberg fellows, they're a husband and wife, Julius and Ethel, and they get convicted of spying and selling Soviet or secrets, nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. They work at Los Alamos with Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, and then crud. I didn't even remember this guy's name for the other classes, with the major physicist named Klaus Fuchs. Doesn't he sound like he should be a major physicist? Klaus Fuchs. Anybody who likes physics has got to have a scary name like that. You know what I'm saying. And he's a German physicist who emigrated to the United States and then worked on the Manhattan Project and then sold nuclear secrets to the Soviets, along with his assistant, his lab assistant, David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother, and the other lab assistant, Julius Rosenberg. And Ethel Rosenberg, I don't think she worked there. I think she transcribed the stuff that they stole. So Klaus Fuchs gets in trouble, so he turns in David Greenglass. David Greenglass gets in trouble, so he turns in the Rosenbergs, both of them in exchange for not getting the death penalty. And then the Rosenbergs get the death penalty. And they tell them, you know what? If you will renounce communism and say you were wrong and communism's terrible, we will not give you the death penalty. And they go like, we love communism. We will not renounce communism. So they didn't, so they got executed. Can you imagine? They were executed with the electric chair. Have you heard of this thing? Electric chair? And when they did executions then, and still now, although we just don't do them as often now, they execute the people and then they come out and they go like at 12:01 a.m. Julius Rosenberg was declared dead by this, that sort of thing. When they did that announcement about the Rosenbergs, the guy was visibly distressed. There's some film of it. I'm sure it's on YouTube, because what isn't? And he talks about how Mrs. Rosenberg, he doesn't say it this way, was not a good conductor of electricity. So she had to get the chair twice. You know what I'm saying? Not pretty. Now, this is controversial because, not necessarily because she had to get the chair twice, but for a couple of reasons. One, we just executed 2 Jewish folks right after the Holocaust. 2, here we are in the middle of the 50s where we value the family, and we just executed the 2 parents of 2 small children. And 3, they were probably the least culpable of all the people involved in this problem, but they were least willing to renounce communism. Okay. Also, there's this McCarthy fellow, you've probably heard of him, Senator Joseph McCarthy. He is trying to make a name for himself, so he gives all these speeches where he holds up paper and he says like, in my hand, I have a list of 82 known communists who work in the State Department. He had a blank piece of paper. Or his roll sheet for class. No, he had a blank piece of paper. And every time he gave that speech, it was so popular, he kept giving that speech, and then he ended up getting the committee. He got to be in charge of the Senate Committee on Communism, and then he got to call people in, and he gained power. So then he thought, well, I'll one up that, and he accused people in the army of being communists. And then the army just went, dude, we're not playing with you. So they said, let's have some hearings and let's put them on TV. And they did. And they hired a really good lawyer that made McCarthy look really stupid and possibly drunk, definitely out of control. And then people started talking about McCarthy and they go like, oh, that dude's drunk. Did you see that? It's like, yeah, I saw that. And then they said, you know what else is true of McCarthy? That dude's in his 50s and he's not married. So you know what? There's only one reason in the 50s that you're in your 50s and you're not married. He's got to be gay. And so people are like, oh, he's gay and drunk. That is terrible. He must also be a communist. And I know what you're thinking. I don't know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I wish I hadn't taken the PSAT this morning. And I wish she'd stop talking about history. But no, it's why they pay me so much. You're thinking, why in the world would somebody think that you're gay and therefore you must be a communist? Because it's the 50s and we're weird. So our thought during that time period is, if you have something to hide, you are more susceptible to the communists finding out your secret and then forcing you to be a spy for them. So the thought was, because McCarthy has some stuff to hide, either he's gay or he's addicted to something, in this case, possibly alcohol, or, you know, maybe he's cheating, well, not in his instance, but other things you might want to hide that would make you susceptible to the evil, godless communists forcing you into spying would be if you were cheating on your spouse, you were addicted to something, you had a gambling problem, or if you were gay. These are all things you'd want to cover up during this time period. So you would rather spy for the communists than admit that you were gay. So people started talking about McCarthy, and then McCarthy goes, oh crap, people are saying I'm gay. So he gets married really fast to a volunteer staffer, an intern, who's half his age and a beauty queen. And then they can't have a baby. So then people go like, he really is gay. And they adopt a baby. And then he gets censured by the Senate for doing this, there's communists in the army thing. And then people went, yeah, he's just accusing other people of being communists to cover up his own stuff. And then he dies of cirrhosis. Oh my God. So his life ends pretty badly. So I think by the time, from the time he rises to power and the time he dies, it all happens within 10 years. He even accused George Marshall of being a communist. Can you imagine George Marshall? You're going like, I don't even remember who George Marshall is. What the heck, kids? George Marshall, Secretary of State, Marshall Plan. You know who he is. Don't be like that. I know you forgot. All right. So I'm going to stop talking there because you stopped listening about 30 minutes ago. I'm just sure of it. I'm just sure of it. But before we go, I'm going to double check the roll and see if you have any questions. So let me stop recording.